Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
The state Republican convention kicks off as tough budget negotiations are still in play. A federal court challenge to ranked choice voting at a recent poll finds most voters don't understand how it works. Will hospitals go along with new requirements to report patient infection rates? And with concerns about the impact here of Japan's nuclear drift, a Climate Watch conversation with Mary Nichols, chair of California's Air Resources Board. Coming up next. Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me tonight on our news panel are Sarah Varney, health reporter with KQED 88.5 FM, and Bobby Gelko, legal reporter with the San Francisco Chronicle, and Josh Richmond, legal and political affairs reporter for the Oakland Tribune. Josh, what is going on at the Republican convention? It's gotten started. Any fireworks yet?
Fireworks right off the bat. You know, this is a convention where the state GOP has a lot to unpack. You know, this is their first gathering since November, when there was a Democratic sweep of all the statewide offices. Coming into this convention this week, they've just had a Republican pollster put out a poll yesterday saying that Latinos, which are proving to be even more of a swing vote in this state than ever before, and whom census figures show are growing at an enormous rate as a share of the population, don't trust the Republican Party very much. And are not inclined to think in terms of what the Republican Party thinks of as core conservative values.
Was that real news to them?
Well, I think it was in some way. You know, they actually tried to put a very positive spin on it. The headline when they put this poll out was, "New poll shows California Republicans can gain ground with Latino voters despite negative image." The fact is, 26% of those polled had a favorable opinion of the Republican Party compared to 62% who had a favorable opinion of the Democrats. But what the poll showed is that they can gain ground by emphasizing things like education, jobs, anti-terrorism, things like that. But you've got a situation right now where the Republican Party is dealing with a delicate budget situation, which we'll get to in a second. They've got a new chair, presumably coming in, a man from the East Bay, in fact, Tom Del Beccaro of Lafayette, who is talking about trying to attract moderates, even some Democrats, independents, young voters to the party, sort of reinvigorate it. The problem is he doesn't have much of a bench, especially after last November's house cleaning. People like Meg Whitman, Carly Fiorina, Steve Poizner are not going to be at the convention this weekend. Even Damon Dunn, who was the nominee for Secretary of State, decided to go abroad and celebrate his birthday somewhere this weekend instead of speaking at the convention. So they're sort of grappling with how to proceed from here, how to sort of get voters to identify with the values that traditionally have been the Republican Party of California's values.
And is there much talk, though, about broadening those values to try and appeal to Latino voters and sort of reading the winds here in California a little bit and stepping back?
I certainly think that's part of the playbook that Tom Del Beccaro is hoping to bring to the party. How effective he is in doing that, how eager the convention is to hear that, it remains to be seen as the weekend unfolds. Remember, conventions, you know, for all of the hoopla around them, they're not always the most effective navel-gazing, true introspective events that you hope they might be. This is when the party faithful are coming together to discuss bylaws and strategy and stuff like that. And you know, a complete change of direction is not always something that party faithful by nature are going to endorse.
Well, it doesn't seem like what's going on with the legislative Republicans is much of a formula for broadening the base.
No. Well, it certainly wouldn't seem that way necessarily. And what we have going on in the legislature right now with the budget is that we're
Let's move to that.
We got partway there this week in that the legislature voted to approve about $14 billion in budget cuts, which helps to close this $26.6 billion deficit that we're facing. And the rest of it, what didn't get voted upon, because there were no Republican votes for this whatsoever, were the elimination of redevelopment agencies and enterprise zones, which is one of the solutions that Governor Jerry Brown has called for, which some Democrats are not comfortable with either, and with letting voters decide in a special election this summer whether to extend by 5 years the current income and sales and vehicle tax rates. And that's something that's going to remain a big bone of contention this weekend. You know, there was a very interesting debate yesterday, actually, between Eric Hogue, a conservative radio talk show host, and John Fleischman, who's a party regional vice chair and a prominent blogger. And Hogue was saying that the party should not be putting itself in the position of standing between the voters and a decision. You know, that it's up to the voters to decide whether this tax extension would be appropriate, and Republicans shouldn't be denying them a chance to express themselves on that. Whereas Fleischman was basically saying, no, we're against taxes. We can't put it on the ballot without assuming it could pass, and the unions will spend enormous money to try to get it to pass. Of course, Republicans usually find some money to spend in elections as well.
So does this bring Jerry Brown any closer, or did it jeopardize him by having this convention where the 5 or so Republicans he thought he could count upon are being pressured a great deal this week?
They're going to be pressured. You know, like I said, there's pressure from both sides. You know, I think there are elements in the party who want to see the Republicans engaging in some way and trying to get something for their votes. And there are those who just think that it's better to sit back and let Jerry Brown and the Democrats try to own everything, even if it's an all-cuts budget. I think this really comes down to both sides actually trying to make the other side own as much of this as possible. And I think in the past, you know, legislative Republicans for the last 7 years, while they weren't always happy, were very rarely happy actually with Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, he did have their back on not raising taxes. This is a different matter, and they've got somebody who's actively trying to make them own not letting voters decide whether to have higher taxes.
Okay, well, now we'll move and see if anybody wants to own something that many of us find confusing. It's called ranked choice voting, I guess. Is that the right title for it, Bob?
Yeah, ranked choice voting, sometimes called instant runoff voting.
Right, and the contention is that there are many people, the polls have shown, that do not understand this system.
Well, you know, you can interpret polls, you know, any number of ways. I live in Oakland. We elected a mayor through ranked choice voting. You know, seems to me that, you know, maybe that mayor might take a little offense if it were suggested that people elected her, you know, by accident or because they didn't understand. I mean, Jean Quan was elected mayor despite finishing second in the first round, running 9-10 points behind Don Parada. But when the second place and third place votes were added up from the others in the race, she won, as is well known. I don't want to go back into that too much. The story is well known, and I want to talk about the court case. But it's a new system. People are voting in a new way. There's always, you know, break-in problems with new systems and a certain level of confusion. Pretty high turnout in the city of Oakland, and I guess I would suggest that people who voted in that election probably knew pretty much what they were voting for.
So let's go to why the courts are involved.
Sure. There's a lawsuit, a federal court lawsuit, by a defeated supervisor candidate named Ron Dudum and a group of voters. And it was argued this week before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. A federal judge in San Francisco had upheld the system last year. The contention in this lawsuit is that ranked choice voting, which operates by taking the votes of lower down candidates, the candidate who finishes last in the first round, and reapportioning their second and third choices to the top tier until someone gets a majority. That ranked choice voting basically disenfranchises, takes the ballot out of the hand of people who did not vote for candidates in the top tier because their votes won't really count at the end, when the final two candidates are chosen between in the tallying.
But Bob, how do their votes count any less than the votes of those who voted for people who just lost?
Well, the distinction that's drawn is that in the traditional primary and runoff system. The top two candidates will be put on a runoff, and everybody gets to vote. And so there, presumably you get a second chance, and you get to choose. You get a second chance. Yeah, but at least you get to choose. You get a voice when the final decision is made. Does that have a legal significance, though? And there were some suggestions in the court hearing this week that it did not. The reason is that it turns out, and this is one of the suggestions that the plaintiffs in this lawsuit are making, well, we could just go to a system where the top vote getter wins, the plurality vote. And the judge pointed out that that's really no different than the ranked choice voting system, except that you get more choices at the start. So you can vote for several people, and it turns out that maybe your first preference, the Nader-Gore model, which I think was kind of the incentive for all this. You can vote for your first preference without really helping the candidate that you want least. Let's say the person on the left doesn't want to help George Bush, but maybe winds up doing that by voting for Ralph Nader. Well, here you can have it both ways. So it's maybe a more, I don't know, sophisticated or more challenging decision for voters, but arguably at least more representative democratically, because you get to vote not only for the one that you might prefer, but for somebody who might share their values, but has a better chance to win.
And who's considered to be, who wins and who loses with ranked choice voting? I assume this doesn't benefit the main parties, that this must benefit up-and-coming parties or independent parties. Parties are having a hard time getting traction.
I think it does to some extent benefit, third and fourth parties, because you can vote for them without giving up your chance to vote for a winner. In San Francisco, it probably benefits the left on the Board of Supervisors, because presumably they can run multiple candidates, and at least one of them will have second and third choices. And it might also benefit kind of a politics of issues, maybe more than personalities, because presumably you build coalitions around people who are like-minded on the issues. But for that reason, a group like Common Cause will say this is more democratic. Of course, the opponents say it's less so, because it takes votes away from people.
When do you expect to hear from the courts?
This case has been expedited, and I'm sure that we will get a decision well before the November mayor's election, because that's going to be the next big test of this in San Francisco.
Okay, turn now to another decision. This is a decision that has to be made by hospitals as to whether they will follow some rules requiring them to report infections. It just seems like a strange question to say why that they could refuse to report.
And it's a valid question, and it's certainly one that I asked a lot of people when I was reporting the story about these new laws that have gone into effect in California that require hospitals to report certain kinds of infections that you get in the hospital. So a lot of people have heard of MRSA, MRSA, which are these antibiotic-resistant bugs. It's true that many of us have MRSA on our skin, for instance. When you go into the hospital, though, there are things that they can do to make sure that, say you're having spinal surgery, that MRSA doesn't get inside your system and give you an infection. It can be quite deadly, actually. But it's true that hospitals have had a difficult time sort of getting a handle on how to count those infections. And so now the sort of science is up to speed. There are infection control boards in every hospital in California. And starting this year, hospitals were for the first time required to actually report on certain hospital-acquired infections to the state. So we got a chance to look at some of that data at the very end of December. It was quite incomplete and pretty mumbled, in part because the reporting mechanism wasn't really worked out particularly well. This next year, in 2011, we should have a much clearer picture of what the infection rate is in California hospitals. There's another kind of hammer coming down, which is that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, CMS, based out of Washington, they are now going to be dinging hospitals 2% in their reimbursements if they don't report their infections. So today, actually, I was just on the phone with the person at CMS who's in charge of this effort, and he fully expects that they'll go from about 50% compliance with their voluntary effort to about 100% compliance. This 2% of your Medicare reimbursements for California hospitals is, potentially millions and millions of dollars.
California hasn't exactly been a leader in this, right? We had a veto previously, and then this bill got signed in 2008, and here we are finally getting the get any information?
Yeah,
what's
now
the
that
problem?
we are the 28th state to basically pass a public reporting law. Pennsylvania is very much ahead of pretty much every other state on this issue. They have a much broader array of infections, types of infections that you have to report. Do remember that you can get an infection in the ICU, you can get an infection when you're delivering a baby. So, and all of these different infection rates are calculated differently. But it's true that California has not been a leader in this issue. When I've talked to people who sit on this board or this committee, this legislative committee, or committee that was created by the legislature, it's 32 people. 30 of them are representatives from the hospitals, and only 2 of them are representatives from consumer advocates. So you talk to those consumer advocates, and they'll say, the hospitals have really dragged their feet over the years and really slowed down the implementation of this process. The hospitals will say, well, this is really complicated stuff, and the stakes are big. If we are putting in we're basically pulling back the sheet, if you will, and showing people the innards of our hospital. And if, say, my hospital accurately reflects and reports my infection rate, but my neighbor, my competitor doesn't, well, I'm going to lose business, and I'm also going to, my reputation's on the line.
Well, aren't you going to lose a few lives too? How many thousands of people die of this stuff?
100,000 people a year in the United States, according to the CDC.
This isn't like a restaurant health inspection.
No,
I mean, this is
a big deal.
This is a big, serious thing.
Yeah.
Why has there not been penalties? There's been no monetary price to pay for not doing it, too.
Well, it's true that for Medicare, and this has been true for a couple years, that if you go into a hospital and you get an infection and there's a series of medical treatments that the hospital has to do for you because of that infection, Medicare won't pay that. They will just simply pay what you went into the hospital for. There's exceptions to that. You can always sort of show that there's other complications arose from other issues. So it's not a hard and fast rule. But so it is true that Medicare has actually tried to push on this issue. And Medicaid pretty soon will be coming online with some similar requirements. But I think, what you hear from the hospitals, and you also hear it from people who try and implement these measures nationwide, is that it is not as easy as one might think to keep track of all these things. You've got thousands of people coming into the hospital every week. You've got to swab them to make sure that did they come into the hospital with MRSA or with C. difficile or some of these other infections. You also have, really what I heard was you also have, generations of physicians who believed that infections, in a sense, were unavoidable and that you just treated them with antibiotics.
Finally, is there anything people can do, patients can do to protect themselves?
Well, I just was down in Long Beach at this hospital, actually, and it was really interesting. Their MRSA rate is practically 0. And one of the things that they do is they actually require their patients to shower before they go into the hospital. And that when they're in the hospital, that they actually wash their hands. That it's not just the nurses and the doctors, but actually patients can do quite a bit to rid themselves of bacteria before they go into the hospital.
At least that's something.
Yeah, right. Take a shower, wash your hands before you get surgery.
Thank you, Sarah.
Of course.
Well, concerns are mounting over the impact of nuclear drift from Japan. Earlier today, Climate Watch senior editor Craig Miller spoke with Mary Nichols, chair of the California Air Resources Board, under both Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jerry Brown in this Climate Watch conversation.
Mary Nichols, thanks for taking a few minutes with us.
It's a pleasure.
You are, of course, charged with implementing the sweeping 2006 law known as AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, and more recently with prodding utilities toward 33% renewable energy by 2020. And we'll talk about those, but first, a nod to what's on everybody's minds right now, I think, not to discount the enormous suffering that's going on in Japan right now. We are getting questions about nuclear drift here in California.
Right.
How involved is the Air Board in watching that, or are you communicating with those who are? And are you hearing the same thing we are, that the risk is minimal at this point, at least?
Our agency is responsible as a member of the state's emergency task force for monitoring events, and we are on conference calls several times a day getting updates from the federal government. The radiation monitoring is done by the U.S. EPA using their own equipment, but they're on land that the state owns, and in many cases they're right next door to our own monitoring stations. And we share a lot of information and perspectives about the way the wind blows. ARB, of course, for years has been looking at deposition of pollutants that are generated from as far away as Asia and making measurements and assessments of what they contribute to our onshore air pollution. So radiation in that sense is familiar to us as another type of pollution, obviously a very serious and long-lasting kind of pollution.
And do you concur with the minimal risk aspect of it?
Yes, well, I think I'm always very wary of characterizing risk in these situations, but for the moment we can say that the levels that are being measured are not far above background levels, and that based on what we know, we would expect that to continue because most of this material will not reach the upper atmosphere and will fall out over the ocean before it reaches our shore. But I think one of the things we've learned over the years in dealing with all kinds of emergencies, whether it's forest fires or explosions at facilities here, is that it's important to give people the factual information and let them make up their minds for themselves about how serious the risk is.
Now that this crisis has caused U.S. reactors to be put under the microscope, do you think there's any implications here for California's efforts to get to that 33% renewable goal? Might we be forced to use more fossil fuels? Do you see any scenario in that?
I don't think so. You know, California has, of course, 2 large nuclear facilities on the coast, and we continue to rely on them. They're very important baseload electrical generating stations in our state. But the 33%, of course, is going to come from new facilities coming online, solar and wind and geothermal and others. We never counted any additional nuclear in that 33% because in our state we're prohibited from building any new plants until there's a repository for the waste, and of course that doesn't exist yet. So this doesn't really change our plans one way or the other.
Currently, of course, there is various groups that identify themselves, changing the subject here now, as environmental justice groups, have filed a suit and won a decision that, at least a preliminary decision at this point, we're expecting the final one any time, that would in essence force the Air Board to kind of go back to the drawing board on some aspects of implementing AB 32. How much of a setback will this be?
Well, excuse me, the judge's preliminary ruling was that when we developed our plan for meeting the overall reduction goals of AB 32, we should have done a larger, more in-depth analysis of a cap and trade versus other alternatives. The cap and trade program is only about 20% of the total emissions reductions that we called for in our scoping plan, and the judge didn't actually challenge the cap and trade rule itself. That was done through a separate rulemaking and has its own very extensive environmental impact assessment, including an analysis of the costs and benefits of other types of alternatives. So frankly, although symbolically, of course, it's a setback if the judge does go final and actually order us to redo the plan, but in reality it will have very little impact because the plan itself is not of any legal force. The cap and trade rule has already been adopted, and in fact it's already in effect. We're not enforcing it right now because we're still working out some of the details of enforcement, but the basic structure of the rule has already been adopted. So it's a little bit more of a tempest in a teapot.
We're running short on time already. We mentioned on the KQED news blog, though, that we'd be talking to you, and we got some questions. I've filtered them for things that were not climate related or pure invective. You know you're a lightning rod, right?
I guess so.
So very quickly, let's try to get a couple of these in. First of all, most of the questions seem to point to a lot of people are still just not convinced that AB 32's implementation isn't going to be a serious drag on California's economy. What can you say to them at this point to really convince them?
Well, the first thing I would say is that we're already in the process of implementing AB 32. We have, in effect, the most important piece, the one that we're relying on for the most reductions in greenhouse gases, which is our auto emission standards. And not only are those standards not a drain on the economy, they are saving consumers money every day at the pump. So I think this fear that somehow this is going to create some new additional burden on the price of energy is just wrong. And I guess the other thing I would say that at least gives me comfort is that we basically had this discussion during the course of the last election. We had two candidates who took very different positions on AB 32, Jerry Brown, who supported it, Meg Whitman, who said it should be at least suspended for a year. And we had Proposition 23, which was a very serious, very well-financed measure on the ballot to try to suspend AB 32 while our state is in the process of trying to recover from a terrible recession. And in both cases, the voters of California overwhelmingly rejected the arguments against AB 32. So that gives me at least some comfort that I'm not out there alone.
I got to get one more viewer question in real quick. From Taggart. He wants to know how many times you've taken alternative transit to work in the past year. He says, bet I could guess. Can you surprise him?
Actually, I walk to work in Sacramento, so I don't take transit here in LA. I will admit that when I go from my home in Midtown Los Angeles out to El Monte, I do drive a car.
Well, that's all right. Walking works. You're off the hook on that one. Thanks very much for taking a few minutes with us today.
Thank you.
Well, my thanks to all of you for joining us in tonight's very interesting discussions. And that is all the time that we have. Our program is available at kqed.org/thisweek to watch past episodes, subscribe to our newsletter and our podcast, and to share your thoughts. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.
Funding for Climate Watch on This Week in Northern California is provided by the Mary Van Voorhees Fund and the Fallis Family Fund.